Welcome to a mini-series of Neurosalience, featuring interviews with some of this year's annual meeting's keynote speakers.
Dr. Zarin Machanda is an assistant professor in the anthropology department at Tufts University, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Biology. Her research revolves around understanding the factors that shape the quality and development of social relationships among wild chimpanzees. Her work so far has focused mostly on the evolution of male-female relationships, male-male cooperation, especially cooperative hunting, and how chimpanzees use communication to mediate social relationships. Most recently, she has started a long-term project to study infant and juvenile chimpanzees and how they develop sex-typed adult behaviors. Zarin is the director of long-term research at the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, an organization that for the last 30 years has conserved and protected the Kanyawara community of chimpanzees living in Kibale National Park, Uganda. She is also on the board of the Kasisi Project, a community development organization in Uganda that works with over 9,000 school children living around Kibale National Park. We look forward to interviewing Zarin today to discuss her research and upcoming keynote at the 2024 OHBM annual meeting. If you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into your specific research path, and what brought you to science.
So my background, I grew up loving animals. I was probably that, much to my mother's maybe disappointment or whatever, but, I was often like poking dead animals and being like, can we take it home and make it feel better? And my dad, for decades had a subscription to National Geographic. And so that was always in our house. And I was always looking at the pictures of wildlife. So I think at a very young age, I really loved animals. And I really was drawn to wildlife. I think there was a part of me in my soul that was like, I want to be an explorer. I very strangely, this is a weird thing, but I saw when I was little a documentary about the chimps in the space program. And in my very young 5-year-old whatever head, I thought that meant that there were chimps living in space and that they would need someone to either study them or take care of them. And because I was little, I just assumed that anyone who worked with animals was a veterinarian. So I told everyone I was going to be an astronaut veterinarian and take care of the chimps in space. It's not a job. It's not even close to being a job. Unfortunately, and one day it might be a job, but I am a little too ahead of my time, I suppose. But I think what that translated into was this kind of transition eventually to wanting to become a wildlife veterinarian. So by the time I got to college, I'm Canadian, so I went to McGill, which is in Montreal.
Me too.
It was one of my favorite places. They have a terrific biology program there. And I thought, okay, I'm going to major in biology and I want to be a wildlife veterinarian. So I didn't know it at the time, but outside of Montreal, there was a kind of newly formed, when I was in college, sanctuary called Fauna Foundation for animals. It was, a lot of them were farm animals that were rescued. But right before I started college, they had taken in 15 chimpanzees who had been retired from biomedical research. I called them up. I asked if they needed volunteers, and they're like, anytime you have that you can spend here, you come and spend here. So I spent a lot of time there. And, this is all happening around the time that I'm taking animal behavior classes, and I'm watching these chimps in this kind of interesting captive setting behave with one another. Biology at McGill is like an intense experience of all biology all the time. But I managed to fit one elective in my third year of university, and it was biological anthropology.
Mm.
And so I started thinking oh, wait, all of these things came together. I'm, studying animal behavior. I'm watching chimps behave in this interesting captive setting. what they're doing in captivity is different than what I'm reading about wild chimps doing. So I'm thinking, oh, there's lots of behavioral flexibility here. And then I'm taking biological anthropology as an elective and thinking, oh, this is all related to humans, right? Like everything I'm seeing in chimps has something to do with human evolution. Like we can start to piece together the story, we can apply biology to our own species. And it was like these three things came together and this light bulb went off that, oh, I don't need to be a wildlife veterinarian. I can study primates. I can do research. And I was so fortunate that at McGill, I had also had these great research experiences with a faculty member and a PhD student there. So I got involved in a lab studying unicellular algae, which is like as taxonomically different from a chimp as you could pot, like they're far ends of this spectrum of life. But I loved research. I just loved doing my own kind of question hypothesis testing. I loved that. And so when I graduated, I kind of just, I hadn't really planned it as a life, but I applied to graduate school and I got in. And I never, I really thought there are maybe 100 people in the whole world who get to study wild chimps. You can't turn down that opportunity. And if you hate it, you can go be a wildlife veterinarian. So
maybe in space.
And then in space.
If you were to describe kind of the current research you're doing to a non-scientist, what would you tell them that you do?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of highlights. So one of the things that I do is I help and I co-direct a long-running field site that studies wild chimps. So it was started in 1987 by my PhD advisor, and I, with my two other colleagues, have taken it over. So in some way, the mandate or like the goal of that project is to study everything about wild chimps that we could possibly study before they go extinct, right? And to document the variation that we see in this one community of chimps and differs from like Jane Goodall's chimps that she studied, for decades. And so I think sometimes it's hard to pinpoint a research question down because our research is like, anything you want to know about chimps, we have data on. And I think the other thing about running a long-term field site is that the way that we collect data and think about our data is that we need to collect data for questions we might have in 10 years, right? Not for questions that we have now, but for questions that we might have down the road. And so what we have is a research protocol or design that has like enough breadth and enough depth to kind of answer questions for a long time from now. The thing that I love to think about is that primates and chimps in particular form really strong bonds with each other. And one of the things that we know is that those bonds are incredibly important for them. I mean, they put so much time and energy into them. And so one of my big goals as a researcher is to understand kind of how those bonds form, but also why they form. So by the how, I mean, like, do they form when they're babies? Do they start to develop those skills and relationships really early? How do they change over the life course? But also like, why? Why are these bonds so important? Do they help them have babies? Do they help them survive? Do they help them have better health outcomes? So that's, I would say, the focus of my whole career is really that kind of question. And then packed in there are these kind of other types of maybe special questions, like really thinking about how baby chimps grow up to become older chimps and what happens to them when they're little and how does that affect them when they're adults. We're just starting a project looking at early life adversity and resilience and like long-term health and lifespan outcomes. And it does seem that like apes that go through early life adversity actually are more resilient and have kind of better health outcomes because they've survived that onslaught. So it's kind of weird because you might predict the opposite. And then more recently, we've been looking at, and this is actually what my talk will be about in June, is leadership and the evolutionary origins of leadership and thinking about, what makes a chimp leader in a particular domain, and what is it about the way that their brain functions or the way that their body functions, their physiology, their individual life experiences, what makes them kind of stand out as a chimp that that leads and can actually motivate others to engage in cooperative behavior.
What are some of the factors that might lead them?
I think it's like humans, it's really diverse. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is, that we often focus on dominance and like rank as like a key part of leadership in chimps. And I think that is a very salient and important part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that correlate with dominance in males and females, and also how very different it is for males and females. But we also have leaders' independence of dominance in other kinds of behaviors. So in things like hunting. And I'll talk a little bit about what makes a chimp an incredibly good hunter, but also what makes it so that when they hunt, everyone else wants to hunt. And we have a couple, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. From the point of view of this group, I think the other stuff that we're doing that's of real interest is that we do have some cognition data. We have some data on how chimps are making decisions and how their minds work, and how that translates into different aspects of leadership. And I'd love for your, people at the conference to try to even think about what that means about the brain and what that means about kind of neural structures and what's happening inside the minds of those chimps. What I would love is for people who do what I do to think more about, like, how does the brain actually work to create this behavior? And I think what I'd love for neurobiologists to think is like, how does this actually translate into behavior in the wild where these things were actually being selected? And humans are pretty complicated and live in really complicated social and cultural environments. So, it is quite a leap to go from a mouse in a lab to a human living in the world.
And how different is it when you study social relationships and structures in a group of chimps? Do those translate similarly to another group of chimps? Because going back to humans, right, our social norms differ
very widely
to where you are geographically. Is it the same with chimps? Do they have individual kind of cultural bubbles, or are they more similar?
They do. I think chimps are probably more similar in their social organization. So, across all communities of chimps, males are philopatric, which means that males stay in the group that they're born into, and females generally come in adolescence. So that creates a very particular kind of social system. Across chimps, males are socially dominant to females. That can change in captivity, but in the wild, that is certainly the case. What differs are, across field sites, how social females can be somewhat variable, going from, almost entirely females almost never interact to very strong interactions. But never do we see female bonds as strong as male bonds. There is a tremendous amount of variation in behaviors like what do chimps feed on and how do they feed on them from one group to another. Some chimps in West Africa use stone tools to crack open nuts, and our chimps wouldn't know what to do with. So, they'd come across a scene and be like, well, I don't know what those things are. We're not just going to keep moving. So there is a tremendous amount of cultural knowledge that's passed on from one generation to another, from individuals to each other, that we would call culture. And I don't think any primatologist would argue that that is culture. It makes, to me, one of the challenges of conservation of chimps, which are endangered, is that every group of chimps is unique in their own way, right? They have their own behavioral repertoire that is different from even the neighboring community. And so it's almost impossible to make a decision on which chimps are more, which one should we save and which one should we let go, because they're all different from each other in some way. And so if you only saved one community of chimps, you would lose like 85% of the behavioral variation that you see in the species, right? I mean, you'd see like just a tremendous amount of loss. I think that makes them so interesting and complicated to study, but from a conservation point of view, it's hard to know what to do. Are they as complicated as humans? No.
Or how does leadership manifest in females and males?
In the wild with dominance. So dominance is kind of like, what we assess is who wins fights. If two individuals are fighting, who wins? The winner is the dominant. And we can take all of the data on all the fights, and chimps actually give a vocal signal that would signal that they're actually subordinate to another. So we can take all of this data and recreate status. And with chimps in the wild, what we find is that males form this linear hierarchy where there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to the bottom. And that every adult male is dominant to every adult female. Female rank is less apparent. So sometimes it's kind of like, well, this bunch is all high ranking, and this bunch is all medium ranking, and this bunch is all low ranking. So and that has a little bit to do with the fact that females don't interact with each other as much. There are 2 females in our group who might not see each other for a year. And so, you're like, well, obviously your rank difference doesn't it's hard to figure out because you never interact. In captivity, that changes a little bit. So females can outrank males in captivity, which is kind of interesting. And I'll talk a little bit in my talk about a study that we're doing to look at some of those dynamics and why. So I think both in terms of, males are all socially dominant in the wild, but I think rank also means a lot to them. I think a lot of their day-to-day activities are patterned, and choices are patterned by rank. Whereas I think for females, it doesn't always play out in these day-to-day interactions where they're constantly like fighting each other and trying to usurp each other. And, the chimp male politics is very much like rank dependent. And sometimes the female politics and leadership is really age dependent.
Do you have some sense as to why the females are not really interacting with each other? Is it just that they don't gain much from those social interactions, or
it might actually be the opposite, that those social interactions are costly for them. So with females, and this is true across most mammals, is that reproduction is energetically costly for female mammals because they're gestating and they're lactating. And so in general, female reproductive success and female kind of reproduction is so tied to energy that a lot of their choices are going to be dependent on what is going to maximize my energy intake. And what maximizes energy intake is often minimizing competition for food. And so what you see, we think, with female chimps is that they tend to be more spread out and solitary because they just don't want to fight for food. They want to kind of have more reliable calories coming in. Whereas for males, food is not as important a driver of their reproductive success. But what really matters for males is having friends or having status. Status or friends. Those are the 2 things that matter. And the only way you can do that is if you interact with somebody else.
And how do you think some of these behaviors can inform us about human behaviors or how they translate from one species to the next?
We could rephrase the question and think about, like, what do chimps in particular tell us about humans that maybe something else couldn't? I mean, the big key here is that this is our closest living relative on Earth. And, as a chimp person out in the field, but also as a human, you watch chimps and it's almost impossible not to see humans in their behavior, right? Like we really try not to overinterpret or anthropomorphize what they're doing. But you're standing there and you're like, yeah, I get it. I see it. It is our closest living relative. It's not surprising that we can see ourselves in this animal. But the important thing is that from an evolutionary perspective, humans and chimps and bonobos share a common ancestor that lived somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago. And one of the things that means is that when we see similarities or differences between chimps and humans, does that mean that trait is evolutionarily old, right? So like if we see a similarity in how chimps and humans engage with something, the most parsimonious explanation is that our last common ancestor did that same thing. And that's a shared trait, right, from an evolutionary perspective with our species. And that kind of framework of thinking about why chimps are valuable is incredibly important for us to think, like, how evolutionarily deep is this trait? Or how much of this is something, a product, if we see a difference between how chimps and humans behave, it suggests that's something that is more recent. that has evolved more recently. And then we're tasked with thinking, well, when did that evolve? Like since, when in the 6 million years since we split from chimps did that evolve? And is that related to incredible increases in brain size that we see in the fossil record, right? You can't say that humans are unique if you don't compare us to something, and chimps are the most obvious comparison. So I think almost everything that we say about chimps can help us understand our own human evolution, whether it's about warfare or parenting or, you name it, culture. Like I think almost anything they do is relevant to thinking about something that we do. We just published a paper on maternal play behavior and play behavior in general. And what was kind of the take-home message of that paper is that mother chimps still have to play with their babies even when times are tough and food is poor, even though all these other chimps stop playing. And that leads us to think, why is it that chimps and humans, why are mothers playing with their babies in chimps and humans and not in other primates? Is it about our social structures? Is it about our brain size? Is it about our really long developmental periods? Like it opens up lots of questions for us to think about, aspects of human behavior. With chimps in particular, I think what happens is because of that social system where moms have to separate themselves from the group, babies don't have nursery friends to play with. They don't have the bigger, they don't have these groups of babies hopping on each other all the time. And so moms become kind of even more important in that kind of system. And it does, it's interesting then to think about humans and how human cultures play with our kids and what's, I think that there's actually getting to your question of variation. I think there's a lot of variation in play across cultures, and not in how, I think play is just a universal, but who does the playing and how, is it grandparents? Is it siblings? Is it, I think what stands out in comparison with chimps and humans is that human parents do a lot of play. And parents of other mammals, even elephants, don't do as much play as you might expect. You might think, oh, don't all moms play with their babies? And they don't.
So given this tight interaction and very close interaction, prolonged interaction between the baby and the mom through play, when do they actually start learning how to engage with social dynamics of the group? Like say if it's a male baby, when do they start learning how to act as leaders or maybe to negotiate social structures?
I think that's such an interesting question. I wish we knew more about it. So I'll confess, there aren't, even though chimps have been studied a very long time, they're also very long-lived. So, the lifespan of a chimp in the wild is well into their 50s. So for us to have data sets that can get at what happens in infancy and how does that translate into adulthood? We're not even there yet. And we have 38 years of data. So I'll tell you that you can interview me in 30 years and I'll have more to tell you about this. But I think the answer to your question is from day one. From the time that they are born, I think they are taking in social information. I think their mother is helping mediate the kinds of information that they are being exposed to, because their mom is the one making social decisions about who they're spending time with and how close they might be to other chimps. So moms are often low ranking to the males, right? They're usually subordinate to all these adult males. And chimps give a call called a pant grunt, which kind of sounds like, right? So that's a call. If a high-ranking individual walks towards you or past you, you would give that call to say, I'm subordinate, right? I am signaling that I am subordinate to you. Do not beat me up. I have accepted the status quo. And so you see females give pant grunts to males as they walk by. And I've seen a 2-week-old baby chimp who's clinging on their mom, and their mom is giving a pant grunt, and you see their lips go, ooh, 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 right? And so they are, even from just like human children are probably getting information in various ways, a lot of times from their parents. I think baby chimps are tuning into the social dynamics of the group as soon as they are born. If you have a chimp that doesn't understand the social rules, they might not survive. And there are some high stakes, especially if you're a male chimp.
I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how you actually collect data on these chimps and do it in a non-invasive way, as you mentioned, and just for the majority of us
Sure.
never done that type of research.
So with chimps, one of the things that you have to invest in to start is to habituate them. So, and this is true for any wild animal that you study, you have to get them first used to human observers. And for chimps, that takes almost 5 years before you can get the group habituated. So it is a real labor of love to start a research site studying chimps. And I would say the first 3 years of our data is saw a chimp 100 meters away and it ran away. The males are easier to habituate because I think their risk tolerance is a little higher and they're kind of just what are you? What are you? Once the males are habituated, you start to get the females, a little bit, but it takes about 5 years before you could really follow a female on the ground by herself, or with her offspring. And that's kind of the point at which we're okay, now we can start using our data. So what does it mean? So for my field site, the way we collect data is we have this incredibly talented group of Ugandan field assistants who are just phenomenal. And they go out in the morning before the sun rises and before the chimps wake up. And they show up to where the chimps have nested the night before, which is a new place almost every night. And then as soon as the chimps wake up, the details are that one of the first things they do is pee. And so we collect their urine because we do a lot of physiological sampling of, cortisol and reproductive hormones and things like that. And then they follow those chimps and they pick a particular individual to follow. We try to follow everyone in the group at least once a month. And they write down what that chimp is doing every minute of the day and what every other chimp is doing around them all the time. And it is this incredible narrative of handwritten notes and check sheets for about 12 hours. And it is in the rainforest. It could be raining. It could be, incredibly hot. It could be incredibly cold. You could get chased by elephants and have to break off data collection. And ultimately what we're hoping is that they stay with the chimp for the whole day. We have these incredibly detailed recordings of everything that's happening. They wait till the chimp goes to bed, they record where that is, and then they hike back to camp. And they do that, we do it every single day. It's not the same person, but it's a team. It is in many ways just this incredibly complete record of, quite literally everything the chimps are doing every day of the year, 12 hours a day. And it's, in some way, if you think about it, it's way, 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 way more detailed data than anyone could ever get on humans. So I think one of the amazing benefits of studying chimps is you have an animal that is in many ways as socially complicated animal as you can get on the planet, that has a brain that is as close to a human brain as any other animal has on this planet. And you can know the most incredible amount of minute-to-minute detailed behavior and physiology that we would never be able to get from humans. We get survey data. And so we have an opportunity with chimps to tie this incredible knowledge that we actually do have about the brains of chimps and how they work, as well as their cognition, with way more detailed behavioral data than we can say for humans. And, to me, that makes them one of the most interesting, probably neurobehavioral model that we have on the planet. The fact that they do live for 50 plus years in the wild, I have a feeling a lot of your group is probably interested in things like Alzheimer's and, diseases of the brain with age. And we have, this is one of the longest lived animals on the planet that does behaviorally complicated things. And, some of my research is really thinking about how social bonds buffer aging. And improve health and mortality outcomes, which is what we know in humans. And with the chimps, we can understand a little bit more about kind of the real details of how that's happening.
You mentioned that, you're having to think about or design your data collection such that you're able to answer questions you haven't even thought.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Do you have a sense of where you see your line of investigation going in the next 5-10 years of research?
Where do I see my research going in 5 or 10 years? I think the more data we have, the more able we are to actually answer the question about early life experience and long-term outcomes. So I really am excited about that, and also to think about early life adversity and these kind of long-term, both behavioral and health outcomes for those chimps. I think that because chimps have some of the longest developmental periods, they stay young for a long time, and so do we, that we can actually make some really important connections about human development. So I'm so excited to get more data on that. I am really, really excited about this link between cognition and behavior that we've been doing. And we've been doing a couple of other experiments, not just with captive chimps, but with wild chimps, that I think are really getting at individual variation in things like temperament and personality. And it ties that to leadership, that it's not just about dominance, but might be about, other aspect, like an almost like je ne sais quoi, like, like this kind of, what makes a good leader might be a little bit about personality, just in chimps, just as it is in humans. So I am excited about that. The thing I'm not excited about 10 years from now is that no matter what we do, we are still losing habitat and chimps are still endangered. And so much of my time and effort is spent towards conservation issues. So I think, unfortunately, as time goes on, we're all going to be doing more of that kind of conservation work, because things are going to just becoming more and more critical for the species that we study.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about the conservation work that you are doing and inform us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, in Kibale National Park in Uganda, where I work, and with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority, I think we're doing a pretty good job. I mean, we have a lot of government support for protection of chimps in Uganda. Kibale is doing well as a national park in terms of keeping its habitat and keeping its range. I actually think climate change is the bigger issue, creating kind of different patterns of seasonality and rainfall that creates food insecurity with people living around the park, and then it puts pressure on the park. The project that I help manage, we do have like a conservation arm of that does work inside the park, where we patrol for illegal activity and work very closely with the Ugandan government to kind of monitor threats to chimps, like wire snares that are placed in the forest that chimps get injured because of those. I think for me, the most important work that I do is with an NGO that I'm on the board of directors for, called the Kasisi Project. And there we work with about 16 schools that are all close to the national park. And we work with about 8,000 to 10,000 kids a year to do everything you can imagine to make those schools as awesome as possible, give students opportunities, keep girls in school. And ultimately, what we hope is that if we can improve the outcomes for those kids and give them opportunities, they don't have to cut down the park when they're older. And in so doing, maybe we can also build a generation of conservationists in Uganda who care about the chimps and the wildlife and the park just as much as we do. And I will just highlight, we have an incredible, incredible team of our Ugandan staff over there doing this work. They're just some of the most dedicated people, not only to chimps in the forest, but to those kids and to, the outcome of those kids, that it's just incredible to see the passion that they have.
Such important work. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yes.
I was wondering if we could maybe close out with if you have some advice for more junior trainees, or maybe some mentorship you've received along the way.
I think that there's something so special about being out in the wild, right? Like, to be out in these habitats with these animals and actually seeing how they behave. I would encourage anyone who even works remotely with animals to spend a little bit of time actually just watching how animals interact with their environment. I think it tells you so much about the thought process and decision making, and what their lives are like. And I think that's important when we're trying to understand how their brains work. So I'd encourage any biologist of any kind, I hope you spend some time in nature and watch the natural world. But more kind of practical stuff. I do value work-life balance as much as possible, but you can imagine that running a field site and being a professor and helping with conservation can be a lot. Just doing any field work can be a lot to have a work-life balance. And I certainly, for example, waited a long time to have kids because I was doing field work. And, I think some of the advice I would give in retrospect is, respect your work-life balance. Like, your life part is as important as your work part. Yes, you might have to sacrifice aspects of your work, but I don't know that anyone would ever regret spending more time with their kids or, like focused on their life. The work will happen, right? The work will happen. It will get done. Hopefully you love your work. And I don't work on weekends. I don't work when my kids are awake. And it's made my life much happier. And I think it's made me a better scientist, a better parent, all sorts of things. So we could work and work and work and work and work. And I do work a lot. But, I think that it's really important for young people to see role models of scientists and professors who say, it's okay to go home on Friday at 5 o'clock. and I would encourage everyone to remember, you will always, like whether it's your PhD dissertation or your postdoc or your, whatever project you're working on, you could always keep working on it. But you probably are taking hours away from something else that might actually improve your overall well-being. And I say that as someone who absolutely loves my job, but I would not love it as much if I was so overworked and, that I didn't have time to actually enjoy life.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And I really enjoyed talking to both of you. So
Thank you so much, Zarin.
my
Yes,
pleasure.
too.
Welcome to a mini-series of Neurosalience, featuring interviews with some of this year's annual meeting's keynote speakers.